The stories say that Fianne MacCool and his Fianne sleep under Tomnahurich. If indeed they do, then 3 of their finest warriors are missing, and the first of these is Fianne's oldest and dearest son, Uiscin. When Fianne MacCool first came to the chieftainship of the Fianne, he was very young. And until that day, for all his life, he had been a fugitive. When he was a baby, he had to be hidden from his clown enemies so that they wouldn't kill him, and as soon as he could walk, he had to run. He never ate where he slept or slept where he ate, and every new day was a new name and a new place and more fear and more running, and so he never quite till the end of his life trusted the place that he slept or the company he found himself in. And those first months with the Fianne, surrounded by fighting men, were hard. So there were some mornings when he would get up early and he would sharpen his spears and he would whistle up his dogs, Brown and Skjolin, who were the wisest and most cunning dogs ever to walk the 4 corners of the green earth, and he would go out hunting on his own. Well, he was coming home from one of these lone hunts one evening. It hadn't been a good day. He'd got nothing but a couple of hares, barely enough to feed his hounds, so he was well pleased when a little white hound leapt across his path and his dogs went in chase of it. He was a little less pleased when he came up with his dogs to find that instead of bringing the deer to bay and pulling her down, they were playing with her, the 3 animals, bounding around like puppies, and what was more, when he took his spear off his shoulder to finish the job himself, Brown turned on him, lifted his lip and snarled. So Fianne lifted his own lip, snarled back and stalked off home, and the dogs followed. So did the little white hind. And when Fianne strode into the yard of the Doon of Allen and threw down the hares for the dogs to eat before stalking off inside for his own supper, the little hind lay down in the yard and waited until the dogs had finished eating, and then, when the dogs went inside to sit by the warmth of the fire, the little white hind went inside too and lay down with them, at which point Fianne, who'd finished his own supper, decided that today had been quite strange enough, thank you very much indeed, and he stalked off to his bed. The hours of the night passed. The moon rose and shone into Fianne's bedplace, and then suddenly he was awake. For somewhere, out there in the shadows beyond the moonlight, there had been a footstep, where no footstep should ever have been at that time of night. Now, had you been watching Fianne, you would never have known for one moment that he had gone from deepest sleep to sudden wakefulness, for he never moved a muscle, except for his right hand, which crept very, very slowly towards the deerskins that his head was resting on, for Fianne never quite trusted the company he found himself in, nor the place where he slept. So he always kept a good sharp dirk hidden in his bedplace. And as soon as he had it in his hand, he sprang free of the skins and sprang for his enemy. And then he stopped. And he sat down and he very quickly pulled the deerskins over his lap, because standing at the foot of his bed, stark naked, was the most beautiful girl a man's heart could ever have thought to wish on. She was tall and she was slender, and her skin was pale in the moonlight, and she had long dark hair that came to the back of her knees, but most remarkable of all were her eyes, which were huge and long-lashed, and as dark as the pools in the peat around the hill of Allen. And she smiled at Fianne as he sat there in his deerskins. "Sorry I am, it is," she said, "to have startled you, Fianne MacCool, and all I did was to come in here and to tell you my story." And she sat down in his deerskins and did. "My name," she said, "is Sarv, and I am a daughter of a lord of the Tuatha the people of the hills. And when I was old enough to be bedded, a druid of the Fomorians came and asked my father for my hand in marriage. Well, he was a darkly handsome man and very powerful, but I sensed that the darkness was not just in his looks, but went right to the core of him, right to his heart, so I refused him, and he went away, very not pleased. And I was right to refuse him, but I was foolish to think that he was gone. For a few days later, when I was swimming on my own in the pools below the falls of Ilbrech, he came and found me, and he struck me with a druidical wand, and he turned me into a deer, and he told me that that shape was the shape I should have forever. I would wander as a deer, and the only way I would ever gain my true shape again is if I agreed to marry him. Unless I could find a man who would break the spell by letting me into his home and to sit by his fire in my deer shape without ever knowing what I truly was. And tonight, Fianne MacCool, that's exactly what you did. And see, the spell is broken, but the druid will have felt the spell break, and he will be looking for me. He won't be able to come to me here within your walls, but I need you to protect me. Fianne MacCool, will you do that? Will you give me a home here and offer me your protection? Well, said Fianne, yes, of course I will. What I'm going to do, yes, that's what I'm going to do. I am going to sit here in my deerskins, and I'm going to call out for Scannell, my steward, and if I call loud enough, he will wake up, and he will come and find you clothes and somewhere warm and suitable to sleep. And Sarv smiled at him, and she said, well, Fianne MacCool, you could do that, of course, if that is what you wanted to do. But see now, Fianne, standing here, it seems to me that that place in the deerskins over there next to you is as warm and suitable a place as any girl might wish to lie down in. Well, Fianne MacCool was not early out of his bed the next morning, nor for many mornings after that, and at first the Fianne were well pleased, because after all, every warrior likes to know that however young his chieftain is, he's going to have good sons and good daughters to be warriors after him. But after a while, they thought it best to send Kilche MacRonan, Fianne's nephew, to have a wee word with him, which is what he did. Now, see now, uncle, said Kilche, the lads and me, we're very pleased that you found yourself a wife you like so much, and her about her women's work already, we can see. It's good, and it's very good that you're getting so much exercise indoors. But see now, uncle, the winter is passing. It'll soon be the spring and the fighting season, your first as chieftain of the Fianne. And we shall have to deal with the Emperor of the world and all his armies, bad luck to him, not to mention the 3 dragon kings of the island of the mighty, and I don't doubt the king of Lachlan as well. So don't you think, uncle, it would be as well to get yourself some exercise outside as well, to make sure that you're fit for the fighting season and in the prime of trim? And Fianne had a wee think about what Kilche had said, and he decided that he was probably right. And the next day he sharpened his spears and he whistled up his dogs, and he promised Sarv faithfully that he would be home before sunset. And he went off with the rest of the Fianne on one of their great hunts that they used to make to supply their larders with. And it was a good day. And they came home early, but with plenty of game, and the sun was still in the sky. So Fianne looked up at the hill of Allen, expecting to see Sarv standing up on the walls of the dune, watching for him, or maybe even running out of the gate to greet him. But he didn't see her, not a sight of her at all. And what he did see were the people of the hill of Allen running hither and yon as though looking for something. And then Fianne thought that something was terribly wrong, and he threw down his spears and he ran, and he found his steward Scannell, and he said, "Scannell, Scannell, where is my wife? Where is Sarv?" And Scannell turned to him and he said, Lord, she is gone." "What?" said Fianne. "How did you let this happen, Lord?" said Scannell. "We were deceived." "See now, Lord, as the sun began to fall from the noon, the Lady Sarv went up onto the walls to watch for you coming home. But I didn't leave her alone. I went up there with her. And after a while, we both saw you coming, walking towards us across the moor. It was you, Lord. I would stake my life on it. So I saw no harm to let the Lady Sarv run out to greet you. But I went down to the gate with some men to watch her go. And we saw her run towards you, and then suddenly she stopped, and she turned on her heel and started to run back, and then we went out to rescue her, but it was too late. The man who was with her no longer looked like you, but dark and evil, and he struck her with his druidical wand and turned her into a deer, and he threw a silver chain round her neck, and before we could reach them, the pair of them had disappeared completely, Lord. They were gone like the mist on a midsummer morning. And we have hunted high and low, Lord, and we can find no sign of her." Well, for the next few days, and indeed the next few weeks, the Fianne hunted every day and not for game. But in all the four corners of Erin and Alba they found no trace of the Lady Sarv. And by the time the spring and the fighting season came, there was no more time for hunting. And when the armies of the kings of the island of the mighty and the emperor of the world had gone, and the fighting season was over, and autumn had come, Fianne had begun to realise that he would never see Sarv again, nor his unborn child that she had carried with her when she disappeared. And early in the spring he spoke to Gol MacMorna, and the pair of them decided that in order to help keep the peace between the Clown Baskin and the Clown Morna, which was never an easy peace to keep, Gol would give Fianne his foster sister to be his wife. It was a political marriage, but the girl was beautiful and she had loved Fianne for a long time from afar, so in the end he was content. But he never forgot Sarv. And in the way of the Fianne there were always other women, but then Gol MacMorna could have nothing to say to that, for he himself had no less than 1,500 sons. And so the years passed. 7 years passed, and it was autumn again, and the Fianne hunting to stock their larders for the winter. They were on their way home, after a very good hunt, and the dogs, who had already been fed on the gralach, were running ahead, almost out of sight, when they heard a dog fight break out. And when they came up to the dogs, they found Bronn and Skjolin defending something that stood between them on a little hill, fighting off the rest of the dog pack, and Fianne's heart leapt within him. But when they pulled the dogs away, there, standing on the hill, was no little white hind, but a brown, naked boy, maybe 7 years old. He had dark hair, and his eyes were huge and long-lashed and dark. But strangest of all, growing between them, from the point of his eyebrows up into his hair, was a little patch of speckled deer hide. So although the boy couldn't speak the tongues of men, Fianne knew immediately who this must be, and he picked him up, and he took him home, and he had him clothed and fed. Well, the wee boy was a clever wee boy, and he quickly learned to speak the tongues of men, and then he could tell his story. All my life, he said, I lived in a cave with my mother, and mostly my mother was a woman, but sometimes this dark, hideous man would come, and he would hit my mother with a stick and turn her into a deer and take her away on a silver chain, but he always brought her back. And the first time he brought her back, when she was still in deer shape, she licked me just here. She was enough of a deer to lick me, but enough of a woman only to lick me once. But even so, from that day to this, I have had this patch of deerskin growing on my forehead. But then one day, the dark man came and hit my mother and turned her into a deer and took her away, and neither of them ever came back again. And I stayed in the cave until all the food was eaten. And then I stayed for a day and a day and a day again, but in the end I was hungry, so I came out, and that is when you found me. And then Fianne and the Fianne knew that in truth this was his firstborn son, and that he would probably never see Sarv again. But the Fianne called the boy Ushen, our boy, our little dear, and Kilche MacCronan took him to be his foster son and taught him to be a great warrior. And he was a great warrior, but he was so much more. He was a bard and a poet and a sweet-stringed musician, and he was wise. And he always gave the Fianne the best advice they ever could have. But he was also his mother's son. And the day came when he fell in love with a girl of the people of the hills. And he went away with her to the Undying Lands. And although he thought he stayed there with her for only a few seasons, when he came back, he found that 300 years had passed. And although he searched the four corners of Erin and Alba, he could find no trace of Fianne or the Fianne, or indeed any man or woman who could tell him who they had been or what they had done or what had happened to them in the end. And worse, the moment his foot touched the lands of men, he became old, ancient, old beyond measuring, and poor and hungry and cold. And he travelled the world telling stories. Stories of Fianne MacCool and the Fianne, which is how we have these stories today. And some people say that in the end he died and was buried in a pauper's grave where no one will ever find him. But others say that because of his mother's blood in him, he cannot die, but wanders the world still, waiting for the last day. The day when Fianne and the Fianne wake up from their sleep and come out from under their hill, because that day he will have his youth and his vigour again, and he will join them in a final battle. The battle where they save the world from the last and greatest enemy of them all. Fianne himself contrived the death of Jermit O'Givna, Jermit of the love spot, Jermit fiercest and fairest, the hawk of Esrua, who sleeps now in the care of Angasog in Bruna Boyna, under the great tumulus at Newgrange, which stands facing the sunrise on the banks of the River Boyne on the southern borders of Ulster. The Fianne were created to keep all evil out of Ireland and out of Scotland, and a hard, hard time they had of it. And when they were not busy fighting the armies of the Emperor of the World, bad luck to him, or the 3 dragon kings of the Island of the Mighty, or the men of the King of Lochlin, or any of the other great foes that came against them, then they hunted to sustain themselves, so that they would not be beholden to any particular chieftain or king, but need obey only their own commanders. And when they hunted in Erin, it is from the hill of Allen in Leinster that they hunted. But when they hunted in Alba, they hunted from the Eagle Stone, which stands now where it stood then, on the banks of the river Fether, not far from the eastern coast of Ross. And that was where they were hunting at the end of a particular winter. A hard and a bitter winter it had been, harder and bitterer than anyone there could remember. And even now, when the river should have been running free and laughing, and the primroses should have been yellow under the oak trees, and the little birds should have been singing in the thicket, the birds were silent. The river was locked deep under a foot of ice, and the snow lay smooth and thick everywhere. There was little enough to hunt and less to catch, and when the Fianne came back to their eating places, they shared what little they had with their dogs, and then each and every one of them pulled his cloak around him tightly, turned his toes to the fire, made sure that his sword and his spears were to hand, and they tried to sleep. And then suddenly, each and every one of them was on their feet with sword or spear in hand, for somewhere out beyond the firelight in the cold and dark, something was walking. And Fianne ran to the edge of the firelight and he called out, "Who's there? Show yourself!" And out of the darkness a voice replied, "Oh, Fianne MacCool, Fianne MacCool, you've no need to fear me," it said. "I'm only a poor old woman, out here in the cold, cold night, so hungry. Fianne, Fianne, will you not let me in to sit by your fire and give me something to eat?" And into the firelight walked the most hideous old hag that anyone there had ever seen. Her skin was grey and blue with the cold, and it showed through the thin wisps of her white hair. Her breast and her flanks were flat and bony. Her eyes were roomed, and her nose was warted, and her mouth was a thin slit that hid only a couple of yellow, jagged teeth. And her breath was foul. Fianne said, "Yes, yes, old woman, come in, sit by the fire, and, well, what little food there is, you are welcome to." And then the Fianne pulled their cloaks back around them, and leaving the old woman sitting by the fire, they tried again to sleep. But after a while, to his horror, Fianne felt something tugging at his cloak, and when he opened his eyes, there was the old woman. "Oh, Fianne MacCool, Fianne MacCool," she said, "it's cold, cold, even here by the fire with just the few rags I have on me. Fianne, good, good Fianne, will you not take me under your cloak and keep me warm?" And Fianne thought very quickly. And then he said, well, old woman, I would indeed. But you see, I have a problem. I have a wife, my first wife, Myrna of the Black Knee she is called. For where she can put that knee, old woman, you would not wish to know, but she puts it there with a great deal of force. And if she found that I had taken any woman under my cloak, however old and however vulnerable, without her express permission, old wife, I would not walk for a week. So I wish I could help you, but I am afraid I dare not. And he pulled his cloak around himself very, very tightly and went back to sleep. So a few minutes later, Ashen feels something tugging at his cloak, and he opens his eyes, and there's the old woman. "Oh, Ashen, Ashen, beautiful, sweet-voiced Ashen," she said, "it's cold, cold out here in the dark, even by your fire, even with the few thin rags I have on. So Ashen, Ashen, of your kindness, will you not take me under your cloak and keep me warm?" And Ashen thought very, very quickly, and then he said, old woman, I would, I really would. But you see, when I was a child and living with my mother, who, as you know, was very often a dear, she made me promise, one of the shearers she was, that I would never take a mortal woman under my cloak. And if I do, old woman, I will lose all my music and all my poetry, which I dare not do, for it would break my heart. So you see, old woman, I would if I could, but I cannot help you. And so throughout the night, as the fire died away, every one of the men sleeping in his cloak under that hill felt that cloak tugged, and every one of them thought very quickly why they could not take the old woman under their cloak, until there was only one man left lying in his cloak on the hillside. And he was lying there quite a long way from the fire, and keeping his cloak very tight around him, and keeping very, very still. For this was Jermut of Jefna, the hawk of Esrua, the fairest and fiercest man the four corners of the green earth have ever known, Jermut of the women. Successful with the ladies, it is true, but not just for his good looks and his prowess in battle, but also because he was the gentlest and the kindest of men. And so, when the old woman tugged at last at his cloak, instead of thinking swiftly and coming up with an excuse, he sighed deeply, and he opened his cloak and let her in. And then, trying very hard not to breathe too deeply, as she shuffled around and wriggled and ground her bony hips into a place where no man wants to have bony hips ground at any time, he shut his eyes and he tried to sleep. But then, to his horror, he felt her start to move again and wriggle round to face him. And when he opened his eyes, she was looking up at him, and she said, "Jermut, oh, Jermut, it is so long since I shared the cloak of a young and a handsome man. Oh, Jermut, Jermut, of your kindness, would you not please an old woman? Would you not give me a kiss?" And Jermut looked at her rheumy eyes and her warted nose and her horrible thin-lipped mouth, and trying very, very hard not to breathe in at all, he bent down and he pressed his own young, warm lips to her stinking, foul slit of a mouth, with his eyes very tightly shut. And then, to his amazement, under his lips her own grew warm and soft, and her breath grew sweet. And when he opened his eyes, there in his arms was the most lissom green maiden he could wish to see. Oh, her hair was like sunlight on primroses, and her eyes were as green as the spring grass, and she was as lithe as a willow and as slick as a grilse. And Jermut reached out to pull her closer, thinking he'd maybe get another kiss and maybe a little bit more. But she slipped away and was gone. And when he threw off his cloak and ran to the edge of the firelight and looked out, he could see no sign of her. She had disappeared as quickly as the moonlight fades away when the sun rises. But then, even as he stood there looking out, the sun did indeed rise over the mountains for the first time in months, clear of the clouds. And away on the other side of the strath he heard the crack and gurgle as the river broke free from the ice, and a little bird sang in the thorn thicket. And all around him, he heard the drip, drip, drip of the melting snow. Fianne's nephew, Kilcher MacRonnan, could run faster than the wind. He alone survived the Battle of Garve and was offered refuge by the Tuatha De Danann in the hill of Ilbrec, where Babinia, the daughter of Elkmar, granted him eternal life and eternal youth. W.B. Yeats held that in the 1890s he could often be seen leading the host of the Shear as they rode above the hill of Knocknarea. But this story is a few centuries older than that. King James IV of Scotland liked to go on pilgrimages. You could say it was a hobby. His favourite pilgrimage was to Whitehorn, because when he went on pilgrimage to Whitehorn, he could make a wee detour to visit his favourite mistress. But he also went 18 times in his reign on pilgrimage to the shrine of St. Duhac in Tain. And when the king went on pilgrimage, as you might have gathered from the mention of mistresses, it was not a matter of hair shirts and shaven heads and ashes, nor was it a case of monks barefoot carrying great crucifixes and chanting hymns. No, when the king went on pilgrimage, he took all the comforts of home, his companions, his court, his servants, his sumpter mules, and even his own entertainment, in the shape of 6 Italian musicians and an African drummer. And every night they would all travel to the home of some great clan chieftain or laird, and there they would be feasted, and after the feasting there would be entertainment. There would be card play, and there would be singing, and there would indeed be the taking of a fair number of drams. Well, one night there was perhaps one song too many, and perhaps one hand of cards more than there might have been, and there was certainly a dram or two more than was wise for men who intended to be on the road early the next morning. So by the time they started out, they were later than they had meant to be, and they were still on the road to the next place where they would be offered hospitality when it began to get dark. And in the dusk they took a wrong turning, and in looking for a right turning they took another wrong turning, and then another, and then another, and the road beneath the feet of their horses became a path, and the path became a track, and the track gradually petered out until, by the time it was full night, and a moonless night at that, they were completely and totally lost in a dark and trackless forest, with absolutely no idea which way they should go to find their way back to the road and the place where they were supposed to spend the night. They were in despair, complete despair, every single one of them, from the king to the African drummer. And then, coming through the trees towards them, they saw a light. And as the light got closer, they saw a man. A tall man. A very tall man. A taller man than any tall man any one of them had ever seen before. And he had long shining hair the colour of copper, and when he came up to them and reached out his hand to take the bridle of the king's horse, they saw that his hand shone as well. And he took the bridle of the king's horse, and he led the horse through the wood, and everyone followed, and he led them out to their road, and without speaking pointed out the way that they should go, and then he turned back into the forest. But before he reached the shadows under the trees, the king called out, You, sir! Who are you? What is your name? Indeed, More to the point, what are you? Are you an angel sent to guide me? And the tall man turned around, and they saw that he had the most remarkable eyes, amber like a fox's, and he smiled a crooked smile. And he said, "Me? An angel? Oh, no, indeed. Not at all. Indeed, you might say quite the reverse. But for tonight, probably best to think that I was just your torchbearer." And then he turned to leave. But he turned back, almost against his better judgment. And then he said, "But it's not the first time I have been a torchbearer to a king. I was torchbearer to Cormac MacAirt once, just the one night, the night that I ransomed my chieftain from him. For you see," he said, "I was with Fianne once." And then he turned and quickly strode away amongst the trees, and although the king sent men to find him, they saw no sight of him at all. So they rode on, and they came to the great house where they were expected, and their host greeted the king, and they were all drawn in and fed. And when the feasting was over, and the king and his host were sitting before a roaring fire with gold beakers of whisky in their hands, his host said, "You were late tonight, sire. It was well dark by the time you got here. We were worried. What on earth kept you so long on your way?" "Oh, well," said the king, "we have had a great adventure. Let me tell you about it." And he did. And when he had finished speaking, everyone in the hall was very silent. And after a while his host said, "Well, sire, you being an Edinburgh man, you perhaps wouldn't know this, but the people in these parts believe that Scotland was once defended and protected by a band of warriors, great warriors such as the four corners of the green earth have never seen before or since. Tall men they were, very tall men, and gifted in strange ways, but they're all gone now, long gone, centuries gone. Well, all except the one. And that was who came to you in the wood tonight, sire. Tonight, you and your party were rescued by Kilcher Macronan himself." There was a time, such a short time, before Ushant went on his wanderings and Kilcher disappeared into the hill of Ilbrec forever, when they were together with St. Patrick and the nobles of the kings of Ireland. And they travelled the length of Alba and of Erin with St. Patrick and the king's men. And the king's men would ask them questions about the Fianne and about what they had been and what they had done. And Ushant and Kilcher would answer the questions. But they did note the nature of the questions and the nature of the men who asked them. And they began to fear for the fate of the land in the hands of these modern men. So in the end, Ushant said to them, "Let me tell you a story. Once upon a time," he said, "there was a king called Feradach, and he had 2 sons. And when he died, his kingdom was divided between them. And one of the sons took the great halls and the great houses. He took the markets and the rich meadows. He took the cattle. He took the treasuries, the bracelets, the arm rings, the necklaces, the jewels. He took the gold. And the other son, he took the brown hills. He took the estuaries and the rivers. He took the wildernesses. He took the wild places, and he took the forests." "Phew," said the nobles of the kings of Ireland. "Well, that wasn't a very fair division, was it?" "Why?" said Ushant. "Which inheritance would you have chosen?" We'd have had the great halls and the marketplaces, said the nobles of the kings of Ireland. We'd have had the cattle. We'd have had the treasuries. We would have had the gold. And Ashton sighed, and he shook his head, and he looked at Kilcher, and Kilcher smiled his crooked smile, and he said, well, he said, you see, the inheritance that you despise, the brown hills, the estuaries and the rivers, the place of the salmon and the lithe otter and the seagull and the seal, the wildernesses, the wild places, the woodlands, the home of the deer and the wild boar and the wolf, of the eagle and the hawk and the hunting cat. This is the inheritance we would choose. This was the Erin and the Alba we fought to protect. These are the things we thought best.